I grew up on a remote ranch, half in Arizona, half in New Mexico. We were 35 miles from the nearest town, which was just a little tiny town. And I kind of grew up on the back of a horse. They had me sitting on a horse before I could walk. And you may have a picture behind me of my favorite little horse, Chico, who was, he was taken from a wild horse herd, and we called him Chico, which means small in Spanish, because he was small for being a horse. And the reason I liked him is when I fell off, as everybody does when they're young and learning to ride a lot, he would wait for me to get back on, and none of the other horses would do that. So Chico was by far my favorite, and he was a great little horse.
Yeah.
And I loved growing up on a ranch, but when it came time to go to school, there was no school. And so I had to go away. I had grandparents who lived in El Paso, Texas. It was over 200 miles away. I went to live with them during the school year and go to school. But I must say, although it was nice to meet other kids my age and do all of that, I missed the ranch and missed my family. And I looked forward to every holiday and the summer when I could be back on the ranch. And that was a great way to grow up, I guess. And when I was in high school, I thought, well, I'd better go to college. And I just applied to one school, and thankfully they took me. I don't know what I would have done if they'd turned me down.
One school.
I went to Stanford, and while I was at Stanford, I took an undergraduate course from a law professor, and he was the most inspiring professor I had ever had. He was wonderful. I didn't know lawyers. I knew cattle people. And so because of that professor, I decided to apply to law school. And I applied right there at Stanford, and to my surprise, they took me in. And I went to law school. There were only 3 women in law school at that time. And I really enjoyed it. Graduated and then tried to get a job. And there were all these placement notices on the bulletin board at Stanford. Stanford law graduates, call us, we want to talk to you about a job. I called every single one of them, and not one of them would even talk to me. Why? I was a woman. And they didn't want to hire a woman in those days. Now, that was a long time ago. But think how different it was. It was just, I was amazed. And I heard that the county attorney in a county in California had once had a woman lawyer on his staff. So I went to see him and told him I would love to get a job. And he said, well, I think you'd do fine. I did have a woman and liked her, but I'm not funded to hire another deputy right now, so I don't have the money to pay you anything. And he walked me through the offices, and he said, as you can see, I don't have an empty office to put you either. So I went back to the Lazy Bee Ranch, and I wrote him a long letter. That letter's now in their county museum. I told him all the things I thought I could do for him if he'd hire me. And I said, I'll work for you for nothing until such time as you finally get a little money and can pay me something. It doesn't matter. And I said, I know you don't have an empty office, but I met your secretary, and there's room in there to put a second desk if she wouldn't object. That was my first job as a lawyer. I worked for no pay and put my desk in with the secretary. But I'll tell you what, I loved my job. I loved the questions that I was privileged to research and try to answer. It was terrific. So I got a good start, but it wasn't the typical start you'd expect. And I hope that I was eventually asked by President Ronald Reagan to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. Isn't that an amazing journey? A big surprise to me, certainly, and I'm very privileged. It was a wonderful place to be and very interesting work. And now I'm retired after 25 years, and I started a website, and I hope all of you will take time one of these days to plug it in. It's www.icivics.org. And I use games to help teach you how our government works, because I want every one of you to involve yourself somehow, some way, in making our government work better, whether it's at the city level, the county level, the state level, or the national level. I hope every one of you will get involved some way, as I tried to do. It makes a difference. So I guess I have to be interviewed now, and I'll stop talking and we'll see what they want to talk about over here.
I'll try not to interrogate you,
Okay.
but I did do a little research about you, including this morning around the coffee and the muffins, and it turns out, no disrespect to any of the other speakers here, but you are the person that these people most want to meet, especially young women. Yeah, so pressure's on. So,
well, I'm happy to say that today there are many more opportunities out there for women to work than there used to be. Thank heavens.
Right. You didn't mention that you were the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court.
Well, I was, yes, and it took 9 years to get the second. It was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I was so glad when she arrived. Recently, I was back at the Supreme Court, and I sat in the courtroom to watch an oral argument from the point of view of someone in the audience. And I looked up at that Supreme Court bench, and there are now 3 women on that bench. And that was great.
Do you miss being there? Do you miss the court?
Well, I don't, because I'm too busy. I've been busy trying to get this website out for young people like these to use. And I've had a few speeches to make, and I've had a few travels to other countries to talk to people there about their system of government. I'm just back, for instance, from Turkey, where I had the privilege of meeting with a lot of officials in Turkey. They're getting ready to write a new constitution, and I'm worried about it.
Why?
I think our Constitution is special in many ways, but one is because it's reasonably short and simple. I mean, every one of you can and have read the Constitution, and you know what?
I think the justice is about to pull out
Yeah.
the pocket Constitution. That is awesome.
See that? Here's the Constitution. It's barely 30 of these little pages long. And I carry it with me always. But I think it has lasted all this time because it's reasonably understandable and reasonably brief and efficient. And I'm afraid what we're going to see out of some of the countries I visit is something terribly long, and it won't work. The European Union, you know, it's that marvelous conglomeration of countries in Europe, which I think has been a blessing. But the participants from each of those countries wanted to write a big constitution for the European Union. And I kept saying, because I attended some of the meetings, keep it short, keep it simple. And you know what they came up with? About 350 pages. It was a huge book for their constitution. And you know what happened? They had to get it approved by all the member nations whose voters had to vote on it. And the voters said no. It was too hard to read. So I think that's a good lesson. We really need to keep these things simple enough that the people governed can read it.
I want to go back to your biography, and you talked about being in high school and having to leave home to go to high school. And I'm just curious, because we have a number of people here, very motivated young people who are in high school right now, reaching the end of that education. What was high school like for you, and what were you like in high school?
Goodness, I was probably scared, like most of us are at that age, worried about what people thought. And it shouldn't matter at all. It's whether you gain a little self-confidence out there. I didn't have much at that age. And I did try to study hard and get good grades, but I didn't want any of my classmates to know that I had good grades, because that would mean I was a geek, is what we called them in those days. I don't know what you call them now. But I thought if people knew I had good grades, they would not want much to do with me. So I tried to keep that
Kind of hid
under
your
the
light
rug.
a little bit
Right,
under a barrel.
right. I hope it's better now. I don't know.
And you talked about being inspired by a law professor, but I'm just curious, yeah, what allowed you, because I mean, I think many of us, our context is our context. How were you able to kind of think outside your own box that you were in? You grew up on a cattle ranch. You didn't think you were going to go to college necessarily, become a law professor, go on to be on the Supreme Court. So
I certainly didn't.
what allowed you to sort of think beyond your own circumstances and think, I can do that, I can achieve
Maybe it was
that life?
because I had so little outside things to experience when I grew up that maybe I was more open-minded. I don't know how that would be. I didn't have the privilege of having a lot of close friends my age. That might have been more of a distraction than a help if I had. I don't really know the answer to that.
So civics is your big push right now, civics
Well,
education, getting people
when
engaged.
I finally got out of law school and was able to talk myself into a job, it was hard to do. I had to work for no pay and put my desk in with the secretary to get a job. But I loved working in the legal profession. It was really interesting for me. And it led to all kinds of things eventually, but never for very much pay, and that was okay. I ended up in Arizona in 1957 with my husband, and again, I went around to all the law firms to try to see if they would hire me. And in 1957, none of them would hire a woman. So I had to start my own little law office with a partner, and we took whatever we could get. And it wasn't the kind of problem that usually comes to the U.S. Supreme Court, I can assure you. But we
Much
managed.
more basic kind
Yes,
of
so it
legal
certainly
issues.
was. It would be landlord, tenant, collections, child custody, divorce, something like that. And so we struggled along with the firm, and eventually my babysitter moved to California, and that was bad because I had 3 little kids and I needed a babysitter. So I had to stay home for about 5 years before I got somebody to take care of the kids again.
But even when you get to the heights of law, the U.S. Supreme Court, it is the people's court, right? I mean, this is where we go to settle grievances. They may be
It's the
much
highest court in the land for both cases coming from the state court system and the federal court system. We have one U.S. Supreme Court where the court can take cases. It doesn't have to, but it can, and resolve issues of national federal law, usually constitutional issues, but also issues interpreting federal law.
So you're known for being a pragmatist in your decisions, in the way you understand law, not necessarily driven by ideology.
Well, I don't know. That's probably because growing up on a ranch, if you were out and something happened, you had to take care of it. I'll tell you an example. One time when I was probably about a senior in high school would be my guess. I was home at the ranch in November, probably for Thanksgiving, and there was a roundup going on. And on the roundups, the men working had to gather the cattle in a certain area of the ranch and meet where they'd brand the calves and separate out the cattle to be sold and take care of everything. It's hard work, I'll tell you. And one day they were having a roundup in the most remote part of the Lazy Bee Ranch, and the roundup cook was not around. So my mother and I cooked the food ahead of time, and I said I'd bring it out to the roundup crew and try to be there by 10:30 in the morning, because they start at 3:30. We would set our alarm for 3:30, and we'd have to be on our horses ready to go by the time the sun came up. By the time you could see, you had to be on your horse. And so by 11 o'clock, they're starved, they're ready to eat. Mm-hmm. So I had to get there early so I could gather up some wood and build a fire and make coffee. Everybody wanted coffee for some reason. Of course, it was horrible. You just dump the grounds in and boil it, and it's terrible stuff, but they would drink it. And I had the lunch, and I had all of this in the pickup truck, and I was about halfway up, and it was the most remote place on the ranch. I had a flat tire. Well, you know, that was a big problem because there was no one there to help me, and I had to get a jack and lift up that part of the pickup truck that had the tire on it so I could get it off. And I could not get the lug bolt to turn at all. You know, you have that long wrench kind of thing, and I couldn't get, and I stood on the wrench and I'd jump on it to try to get it started to turn. It was terrible. It took me a couple of hours before I ever got that stupid tire off the truck. I don't think it had ever been off. And I finally got the tire changed and got up to the place I was to meet them. And I was late, so my father, he could see me coming. He wouldn't even talk to me. He was so mad. And he finally got close enough and he said, "Well, I see you're here." And I said, "Well, I'm so sorry. I had a flat tire and I had to change it." "Well, you should have started earlier," his only comment. So growing up on the ranch, you just had to get the job done. No excuses. No excuses.
That's the preparation for the Supreme Court. I want to ask you, because civics education, you can assume that if young people are going to engage that, it's because they want to be involved in civic life, in politics.
Yeah.
And you've
maybe
served
not even that, but suppose you see something wrong that you think ought to be changed. Suppose it's at the city level. Suppose you think the park needs a place where you can go rollerblading, for example, and there isn't one, and you want to do it. But so you want to persuade the city to do that. You have to know how you can get that done, who you talk to, and what you can do, even as a teenager, to get that to happen. And it's possible. You can manage to get changes you want to see, even at your age. And that's why I started the iCivics website, to try to get young people to understand how they can solve problems and do it.
Right, using digital media and
Yes.
learning inside or out of the classroom. But what do you say to young people who are looking at a political system that really is divisive right now, where there's a lot of mudslinging and yelling and fighting, to encourage them that this is a place where they can go and make a difference?
There is. I don't like what I see and hear today either. But what I want each of you to learn as you're in school is, even if you disagree with someone about something, learn to disagree agreeably, okay? It's all right, but do it nicely. Makes a big difference.
Well, I want to thank you so much for your time. Former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor.